All right, this is the Gateway API meeting for September 13. We've got lots on the agenda, all added by me at this point, but anyone can feel free to add their own content if they want to. The first thing I have on my mind is wondering if anyone wants to lead the community meeting on September 20. So this same meeting a week from today. I'm going to be out actually visiting family in Canada. So if anyone wants to lead the meeting, that would be awesome. Any volunteers?
If no one volunteers, I can do it. It's Bowie.
I was literally about to say the same thing, Bowie.
I'll let you two work that out. But thank you both for volunteering. I'll add both of you, and you can, I don't know, unless one person wants to take it over the other, I don't care. All right, sure. Next one is a heads up for another community meeting for whoever wants to be part of this discussion. Tim had been reviewing another KEP as he was doing our review, and that KEP also would benefit from this kind of cross namespace reference that we're allowing with reference policy. And you've already seen, if you've been looking through our SIG network review feedback, that hey, it'd be really cool if we could make this more generic and useful to more than just Gateway API. So it seems like reference policy is at least somewhat popular in concept, and it seems worthy of a discussion at SIG Auth. The KEP that I mentioned is the storage bucket KEP. I've linked to it here. This is being driven obviously by SIG storage and really just trying to build a Kubernetes API for provisioning storage buckets. There's a bit of discussion. I chimed in here, and Tim had mentioned the connection to reference policy as well. So feel free to comment on this KEP as well. But because there's this kind of two APIs coming together that have potential across SIGs to make use of a resource like this, it may make sense to see what is out there. I sent out an email. Anyone who's on SIG Auth mailing list would already have seen this, but I sent out an email today to SIG Auth just to start the conversation. And I have something on the agenda for this coming Wednesday to discuss, one, does reference policy make sense? And two, if it makes sense, should we look at some kind of more generic place than Gateway API for it to belong? So yeah, that's this discussion. If you're interested in this, I just heads up that this is happening. And maybe I guess this would be a good time if anyone is aware of any other potential uses of reference policy, that would be really helpful to include in this discussion.
So but I imagine, Rob, like we can't block on this, so I imagine this will just be a pretty long discussion.
Yeah, I agree. This is probably not something that we can block on. Completely agree with that. But I do want to at least make sure that we've done our due diligence. I think a good sign would be that SIG Auth says, hey, this is a good idea. We should pursue it further. Like, part of this is also getting a review from SIG Auth on this API that is network related, but really closer to authorization anyways. So looping them in just to review this API is helpful. And then second, a nice positive would be if there was a path to make this a more generic API outside of Gateway API.
Yeah, in my mind, the best win at the end of the day is that everybody agrees that this is like a good idea, and this ends up as a core object rather than a Gateway API object. That would be very good. I don't know if it's actually useful enough for that to happen, but that would be really nice. Yeah,
no, I agree with that. One of the things I had a brief discussion with him about this on Friday as he was reviewing the last chunk of Gateway API. And one of the things that came out of that discussion is maybe reference policy is something that does have to move to resource instead of kind references, which that makes things a little messy. But if we're trying to turn reference policy into a more generic thing, we can't necessarily guarantee that every implementation of reference policy is going to understand the kind to resource mapping. That's tangential, but that's a kind of change that could come before we release V1 Alpha 2, depending on broader feedback. I don't know.
One last question about that, Rob. Is that
Yep.
the SIG call that's at like 11 a.m. Pacific on Wednesday?
Yeah, I'm sorry. It's a terrible time, but yeah, that's the meeting.
Okay. I mean, I'd really like to go, but I don't know if I want to go enough to get up at 3:30.
I completely understand. Yeah. Well, hopefully it's recorded, and yeah, I'll throw an update in the in Slack channel at least. Cool. All right. Moving on to the next thing. I have been working with, well, just sketching out myself an idea of what API compatibility guidelines look like for CRDs. This is by no means approved or final in any sense of the word. I'm just trying to, a lot of our discussions, a lot of what we've been working towards now is how can we better prepare ourselves to build a backwards compatible API? So how can we limit the kinds of breaking changes we'll make in the future and make this truly backwards compatible? We haven't really talked about what that means. And I have just sketched out some thoughts that may or may not make sense. I can throw this into an issue for more conversation, but just as a rough starting point, I was thinking the following guidance could make sense for implementations. One, that any validation we provide as a project cannot be a truly reliable means. Webhooks can either, versioning can get out of date, they could break, they could not work, whatever. CRD can be modified. Again, these are edge cases, but we can't rely on that validation completely. And that kind of leads to this idea that validation could be loosened in future API releases. So if implementations are relying on CRD validation or webhook validation too tightly and can't handle other edge cases, it could result in a bad situation. It could result in this place where we can't loosen validation safely because
I think, Rob, you might want to talk about why CRD is different, because we really do have very detailed Kubernetes, well, sort of detailed Kubernetes backwards. Even Kubernetes gets it wrong.
Yeah.
So yeah, we should first talk about why CRD is different in this case.
Yeah, that's a good. So I've just been, I had some thoughts that I tried to run by Daniel Smith and Jordan about just what is really possible here compared to upstream. And I've been guilty of trying to think of CRDs as, hey, we can create the upstream API experience, but that is not because as you said, Bowie, it is pretty well defined. Well, I don't know, well defined, but there are pretty clear patterns that we follow there. And that's because we're trying to basically keep API server and controllers, specifically controller manager, in sync. And you have these compatibility guarantees and all this stuff. With CRDs, it's a little more loose in the sense that we don't have all these components all tightly controlled in the same system. We don't have quite the same guarantees that we can even offer if we wanted to. And our validation capabilities are also significantly weaker. So given that, I think what we need to end up with is, and I should probably be more detailed in that, but I think the high level summary is that we need to end up with something like where implementations can handle and basically not crash when validation does not work the way they expect it to. Maybe that's too naive, but that's my current understanding of where we need to end up. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I see what you're saying, but I feel like the sort of endpoint of that is that why have the validation at all? Like, if you can't rely on the validation to screen out incorrect values, then you're gonna what you're gonna end up having to do as a controller writer is just to do the same check that you would do in the validation anyway.
Yeah.
Well, validation is for the user.
I think that's the conclusion I've come to as I've been trying to process this and trying to understand how we could loosen validation. Like to go back to something that we've dug into quite a bit is port. Should it be optional or not? And half of that is deciding, can we make a field optional in the future if it's currently required? And that kind of change is difficult to do. Like, that's essentially loosening validation. It's similar in concept anyway. And that's a kind of change that's difficult to do in an orchestrated fashion if you have multiple implementations of an API working and you don't know the versions of all of them. And so I think that leads to Bowie's conclusion or statement that basically feedback exists to provide a better experience for users, but it's entirely possible that implementations may support a subset of input that is allowed by the API, and so may already need to do additional validation. I don't know. I'm trying to find the right balance here. I know it's a real pain to try and do all this kind of clients implementation side validation in addition to validation that already exists in the CRD, in webhook, etc. So I don't know.
I hear what you're saying, and I think it does make sense to sort of have the rule be that the CRD validation is for users. Yeah, that makes sense. But like it feels like the validation is just as much part of the API as anything, in that the same rules should apply to the validation as to adding, changing, or removing fields. Like, you shouldn't. It feels to me like making a required field optional, like, feels like you're almost getting to a point where that's an API rev, right? Like, and that that maybe there are classes of validation change that are significant enough changes that they should be an API, like an API rev.
I think Rob, we might want to take this to a doc, because this one, the subtlety here is that what we want to do is create a ecosystem in which the controllers might get a little skew of each other. Let's say you have one user's cluster, the infrastructure provider is going to be installing the CRDs, and then they may be using, something that they installed themselves, like Nginx or Contour or what have you. And what we want to do is make sure that everyone's implementation meets some certain criteria such that even slight skews will not just cause things to majorly blow up. And one of these things is if the webhook is slightly off, that it's not the case that like an entire set of infrastructure just stops working altogether. I think at the outset, my general sense is in the beginning, actually this will be not as much of a problem, because there's basically just one version of the API lying around. This will become a problem in like 2 years, right? Whereas people get stuck on software, some people refuse to upgrade because things are still working, and kind of we have more skew in terms of versions.
Yeah, I hear you. Version skew sucks. So yeah, I mean, I think I definitely am in favor of a document about this. I think that, it is worth discussing the subtleties here, but like, in my mind, I think there's a pretty sharp line you can draw between the basic validation that's available using, say, the KubeBuilder annotations, and the more advanced validation that you need a webhook for. If it's, yeah, like if there's simple validation, like, hey, can only be a host name, and you have a regex on there to validate the host name, like that feels like a pretty basic validation that shouldn't change very much. And if it does, that's a big change and should be treated like a big change. If you understand what I'm saying, like the fear, like, and you should be, the object that you're looking at should be different enough via having a different version to make it so that it's clear that you're operating on a different thing.
Yeah, I agree. There's a good bit of nuance here, and certainly for those major changes like dropping, make required field becoming optional or something like that. That does seem like something that likely requires an API rev, a new API version. I think I'll need to double check that, at least in upstream. But yeah, this is a complex topic. I just want to get thinking about it now because it has to guide our decisions around what, V1 Alpha 2 is this release that we're really trying to keep everything about compatibility in mind, and just having this discussion now and, going forward in a doc about what that looks like, what we're committing to, and what we want implementations to, be able to handle, right? Because we know there's going to be skew in clusters, and we know our implementations of this API will at least be able to handle some amount of skew. We just need to define how much. Yeah. Okay, well, any last comments or discussion on this? I can take an action item to just turn this into a doc. But I just wanted to get an initial feel for what we're thinking here. Cool. All right, I'll keep on going then. This is the GEP that I had created to allow multiple cert refs per gateway listener. I think there's fairly broad consensus on the idea as a whole, but we've gotten locked into, well, not locked into, but there's some discussion in here that I think should be called out and brought back up to this level. One of the bits of confusion here is on what wildcard domains actually match. My understanding from looking at Envoy docs is that a wildcard domain, and they're in virtual host, matches n labels. There's no restriction on the number of labels that can be matched. Does that sound accurate, or did I miss something?
No, that's an RFC restriction. You're only allowed to match one label.
There's
look
different
for
matches.
RFC 6066, I think.
That's for SNI, but is that, if I'm remembering correctly, I know there's a very clear restriction on what SNI can be matched, like a single label, but I don't know if it's true for hostname matching in general.
Yeah,
There is no
mention
standard for
match,
hostname
I guess.
matching.
I mean, this is SNI. I mean, I think the implication, is.
So the problem is, James, that you have to have the SNI and the hostname line up. And so both come into play. It's not just the SNI that's important in this case, because you have to have both of them line up.
No, but this is about certificate selection, right? This is about which
It
certificate
is,
which certificate do you choose when you get a when you have a wildcard certificate and you have a actual fully qualified host.
There's nothing in our spec that says that you can't have a wildcard certificate and a wildcard hostname.
But you never wait. Sorry.
Right, like, and so like, if the wildcard hostname is what Robert's saying is, if the wildcard hostname for the route is star.example.com and Envoy will match star.star.example.com, then that's relevant to this discussion about the SNI, because like
Envoy will match star.star to what?
So like, so what it's saying, so John, just before we keep going, like, John, can you make a comment about what Envoy actually does?
Yeah, so what Envoy does is there's kind of three matches. One is actually routing on the SNI, in which case it's just a string match, so it'll do multiple labels. And then there's routing on the host header, which is the same. And then there's actually matching, or not really matching, because Envoy, as far as I know, doesn't have like a dynamic like, hey, for the like, just give me a bundle of certs and I'll pick the right one. But for verifying TLS, it will do the single label as per the RFC. I don't know. Does that make sense?
So if Envoy has multiple certs, it won't. You need to
I don't
have,
actually know what
like-
happens if you just give Envoy multiple certs, to be honest.
Yeah. It's poorly defined, at least.
But that's the
Yeah,
thing
we
that
only ever
actually
give it
matters,
one, so.
right? Is given a host name, how do you choose a certificate, right? And when you're choosing, and if you have a wildcard certificate in your certificate store, the star is only allowed to match one DNS label, right? That's the thing that I think that ultimately all this stuff has to align to.
Yeah, so I think there's a few things at play there, and I agree that the implementations can and should choose certificates that way for sure. But I think, and Harry, you can remind me if I'm remembering this conversation incorrectly. But my example here is basically saying that star.example.com could potentially be used, at least by some implementations, on a gateway to match both, basically 2 levels deep of subdomains. So store.staging and app.staging.example.com. And that's my understanding of how Envoy matching would work. Does that sound correct?
Yeah, but I think it's not just about.
That's a change
TLS.
though, isn't it, Rob? Because as I recall, we made the SNI matching stay exactly the same as the listener matching.
Right, but
Or was that changed?
I don't think that Envoy is capable of only matching a single label, but I could be wrong on that.
On the host header, so you need to be. This is one case where you need to be careful about ensuring that you're talking about the right thing. So what John was saying before is that Envoy can match things on. Yeah.
Can't you do it with regex, by the way, if you had to translate it?
Envoy doesn't support it. I mean, we don't have to derive everything from Envoy in the spec, but
Yeah.
given every implementer is pretty much Envoy today, it holds some weight at least.
Yeah, I think we want to at least make things, have a spec that's possible to implement with Envoy, not necessarily drive the spec by Envoy, but if you can't implement the spec with Envoy, we've made a mistake.
Well,
I think it's confusing
opinion.
the
because
number one implementation of Ingress is Ingress into Next. So I think they're going to do gateway, even though they're not
I guess
necessarily
what's the
regular CM.
semantic between, because I don't know if it's possible in all implementations to filter first by the host name, which is a looser match, and then attach a certificate to it. Is this the proposal?
So
No,
everywhere's got to do the thing where you do the SNI match first because you don't have access to the host header until you've done this.
Right.
Right.
So
John
this-
has his.
yeah, okay.
Yeah, it feels almost like fundamentally there's kind of 2 different ways to do routing out in Ingress. Like one is what I think the spec is supposed to be, in that you match the SNI, you say this is my certificate for that SNI, and then these are the routes for that SNI. The other that I've seen is kind of, here's a big bundle of certificates, and I just want to match anything. I'm going to automatically, look at the certificates, see the host name, pick the best match. That's like the most exact one. And then for that certificate, like we're going to do this routing. It's almost like certificate driven, rather than first saying match the SNI and then this single certificate goes to that SNI. So
But
is there some
match
tension there
which
that some
chooses the
implementations are
certificate.
doing something like that?
I
I believe that's how the
thing, though.
GKE. Sorry, we can't. Sorry, keep
Sorry, go
overlapping.
ahead, John.
Yeah, I know. I was just going to say, I think actually that is how the GKE implementation works. Isn't that somewhat right, Rob? The latter one, not the way, not the.
Yeah,
SNI
the
match.
big bundle of cert. Yeah.
Harry's also got his hand up.
Yeah, I think there is another. So discussing on SNI is important, but there is
Am I audible?
Yes, you
Yeah.
are
Yeah.
now. Much quieter before.
Okay. So there is this other concept where so in a listener you have a host name, and then you have routes. So when I actually commented here, what I was trying to figure out was if I have a star.example.com in my listener, what kind of routes will be picked up? Let's say foo.example.com, I expect that to be picked up. But what about bar.foo.example.com? According to, like, imagine there is no TLS in the world. In that case, our spec says that you cannot have two level of nesting, like just plain HTTP matching. Where is everybody's understanding on that topic? And then we can dive into SNI.
Okay.
My understanding is the same as yours. It's a single DNS label.
Yes. The spec currently explicitly says that the only valid that star is only valid for one label in the hostname field between the listener and the routes. So if you have star in one field, it can match one label in the other one or one star. So you can't, it won't do, it shouldn't do multiple. And it, if Envoy, if that's not the behavior that Envoy has, I can't remember if it is or not. I think I remember one of the guys that I was working with telling me something like that. Then that sucks. John.
Well, it's actually kind of interesting because there's a difference between the matching of the route and the gateway, which is something that's most likely implemented by the control plane, and the actual runtime matching of the proxy to a given request. So for example, if I had star.example.com in both places, I could say there's only, those labels are aligned, that's fine. But then at the Envoy level, when I'm actually doing the matching of requests, then a.b.c.example.com would still match star.example.com, right? But Envoy does do just like a string match, so it is matching multiple labels.
Right. So the star is like a more unbounded glob than a single label in the Envoy. Once it's actually rendered down to config on Envoy.
I know that at least one of our implementations we pre-filter in the controller so that the things that don't match looks like, if I recall, doesn't actually get programmed.
Yeah. Yeah, that's entirely possible. But we have to distinguish between matching and, like, if someone has star.example.com on both things, we can't, or at least some implementations can't limit that to a single label. But actually, I see hands still.
Yeah, I think that John's point was fair, that you can, on the ingestion, like that you can say that if the single label doesn't match between a gateway listener and a gateway route, then the route must be rejected, right? That's what the spec says. But like that, yeah, but then what happens is for Envoy, once that actually gets rendered out to config, if a thing comes in for abcexample.com, then it'll get routed, right? But that's the way that Envoy works, right? Like, so there's a weirdness in the behavior there because of the way that it does string matching, and that's a greedy glob. It's not like a single label glob. But I don't think that we should change the way that the gateway and the listener hostname need to agree for the gateway. So the listener hostname and the route hostname need to agree for that two-way handshake to succeed.
Yeah, that seems like a fair distinction.
And so, like, I think it's fair for Envoy implementations to say, if you are doing a wildcard cert and a wildcard route, then there's this weirdness that will come up, right? Like, it's a pretty specific thing. Should you be doing, like, I'd argue you probably really shouldn't be doing double wildcard. That's weird. But if you do, then yes, there's this weirdness, and that's one of the things that, that's an Envoy specific implementation thing that we need to call out. Like, that we, being the people who are like maintaining Envoy based implementations of this API, need to call out.
I think if I followed everything that Nick said, I agree with him.
Yeah, so I think the spec needs to be, the fact that it's a single label is really important for the spec, and it means that in this case where we've got to match so the thing that's different about this, the cert refs and wildcard matching, is that now we've got 3 host names that you need to match. You've got the SNI that's in the actual certificate, the host name that's on the listener on the gateway, and the host name that's on the route. And if you can have multiple levels, if the glob is greedy on any of those, then you get a combinatorial explosion of things that it could possibly be. And having it be a single label makes the whole, the way that the 3 things interact much easier to understand.
Yeah, and I think having a single rule across all those cases it simplifies it for users a lot.
Yes. I think that, yeah, and like, and you know, one of the things that I remember we found when we were implementing the Ingress v1, which had a similar thing, was that there are a lot of edge cases around, like, what happens if you have, you know, a wildcard on one side but not on the other? You know, what happens if you have a cert that's not a wildcard and a route that is a wildcard? You know, or vice versa. You know, if the wildcards don't match up, and you know, there's a bunch of things that we need to be clear about the behavior for when we add this. And yeah, and I think I thought I had commented on this PR, but obviously I haven't. Sorry. Yeah, but so I think that's if I would to summarize the feedback that I will give, it is that we need to be extremely specific about how these 3 fields now interact. It's not just 2 fields interacting.
Okay, this all makes sense. I think my biggest takeaways from this are that we need to be very clear in the spec that when controllers are implementing the merging whatever between route and gateway, we need to ensure that is done on a single label match, that star.example.com on a gateway should not match a.b.example.com on a route, that as far as the route and gateway attachment. Beyond that, though, we need to recognize that for actual request matching, not every implementation is capable of restricting wildcard matching to a single label. So we need to let the spec allow for that. Do those 2, I know there's more here, but do those 2 statements seem accurate?
So is the proposal that it has to match up in the API config, but the behavior might be different?
Yeah, because you can solve a lot by just not attaching the route. If you have a route for a.b.example.com and you just don't attach to the gateway because it doesn't match those dynamics, like it doesn't match star.example.com from the API perspective, you've solved at least some of your problem that way. Not all of it, but
if you had star in both places, you would still match a.b.example.com.
Yeah, unfortunately,
we would just say that's just too bad.
Yeah.
This is just one of those implementation details, and there's always going to be, you know, dozens of those for everything, right? Any kind of general spec, a specific proxy is going to have, you know, overlap and corner cases.
Yeah, for sure. I just think we need to be cognizant that there are some implementations out there that are not going to be able to restrict that wildcard matching. So that's my perspective, at least. It feels like at least mentioning in the spec that not every implementation is capable of this behavior. John, you still have a hand raised. Is that intentional?
No.
Okay, cool. So yeah, this is a PR. It sounds like a lot of you are planning to comment or may have already commented on this one, so we can continue the conversation here. It's 8:56. Any last comments or thoughts on this? Cool. All right, I'll keep on going then. The next one I added is, I think this will be a pretty short one. Back to reference policy, Tim left one comment in his review that was really asking, do we need spec and status for reference policy? I don't have a good answer to that. His suggestion was that if you don't think you'll ever need status, you probably don't need the distinction between spec and status. I'm unsure. Can anyone think of a compelling use case for status here?
In my mind, the status is for like, if you want to be able to have it be like, hey, you defined a reference policy, but it doesn't reference anything, or something, or you've defined an inconsistent reference policy, or there's something broken with your reference policy. But that, like, I don't know if we would actually want to do that.
It seems handy and consistent to always have a spec and status on every field. Like there's tooling that kind of reads statuses even of arbitrary things and looks at the conditions and stuff.
Yeah,
if
I'm
we
very
don't have
hesitant
it, then
to
we can never
blow
add
it
it.
up.
Like,
I
Yeah,
think
I
like this
think-
is one of those that you make a decision and then this like truly locks you in. Like, oh no status forever.
Yeah. So one concern about a status for reference policy is that it is, like many of our resources, one that would be complicated to implement status for, because you don't have a single implementation or even single kind of implementation, potentially, depending on how portable this gets, that is responsible for reading from or implementing based on this reference policy. So populating that status gets into this kind of messy thing where you need, like controller name or some concept of that, which we have some precedent for, but it's, I don't know. I don't know how I feel about that.
I think like the worst case would just be to leave status out, but keep spec. I think the dangerous case is to just get rid of spec and kind of because then that is the choice that makes it impossible to get it back.
Does anybody who's dealt with network policy a lot have any regrets about that not having status?
Yeah, that would be a good, that'd be a good follow-up. Should ask in their Slack channel just to be sure. I don't have a lot of experience there. It does seem like what others are saying, that the safest thing is to leave spec and status in place unless we're completely sure that we'll never need status. And it seems like status is unlikely but not impossible. Does that seem fair?
Yes, I'm definitely a -1 that I'm 100% confident we will never need status.
Cool. Well, yeah, if anyone wants to comment on this one, this is 861. This is, for anyone that missed it, I created a second PR that hopefully won't get as massive, but 780 had just been dying under the weight of comments. So this one has a more manageable 25 right now. But yeah, if you want to comment on this one, it's the last comment in here. Would be good to get different perspectives on this one. Cool. All right, the next one, potential for wasting some time on this one, but I had been discussing, I see Mark's on this call, discussing naming with Mark and ways we can simplify the routes section in a listener. He and Shane had done some great docs improvements around cross namespace routing, but as part of that, looking at the examples, they may have been at least slightly more confusing than I would have hoped. And by no fault of the examples themselves, just the wording, the whatever. One suggestion Mark had was, hey, could we maybe rename allowed routes to route constraints? That seems like, to me, it's a slightly better name here. It sounds like Nick and Harry have added +1s, and John has some concern. So I'll hand it over to John to maybe add your hesitation here.
yeah, this is like a very, very weak hesitation, but it just seems like constraints. I mean, I don't know. I'm a native English speaker, so it's not a huge deal for me. But for someone that's not, like, it's kind of a word that I haven't seen in the API before. It's kind of long, kind of hard to spell. this is like a very vague concern, but if we could make it slightly simpler, I'd be happier. But I also don't have any better suggestions really, so I'm fine with this if there's no better ones.
Sorry, Rob, what one of the bits of feed, I'm just reading this, is that allowed routes.
Yeah, so more context on this was just routes. The name was just routes, and SIG Network Review, I think it was Dan had mentioned, hey, routes does not seem appropriate anymore because this isn't a list of routes, this isn't a selector, this is really just what kind of routes you accept. And so this is more a limitation on the kinds of routes you accept.
I think it might be a little confusing. Is allowed routes a list?
No, so yeah, good point. Allowed routes is not a list. It is two things. One, you can specify the namespaces that you trust routes from, and two, you can specify the kinds of routes you want to support. But that's it. So it is no way a list.
I am vaguely against the constraints, because constraints usually is a set of constraints that then you somehow solve to get the thing you want. But it doesn't sound like that's what we have here.
It's effect. Yeah, I mean, the original proposal I think came up because in the docs we were trying to give it a generic term for it, and we actually called it selection constraints, which I think would be way too long for this. Also, I wanted to ask: weren't there originally thoughts of gateways selecting things other than routes? Like, should routes even appear in the name, or is that making it way too generic for this purpose?
I think that may be a step too. I think there's definitely possible to support custom route kinds, but I think it's going to be just different kinds of routes. That's all I've thought of so far.
Yeah, I agree.
I think saying allowed routes is fairly intuitive to what it means. Route constraints is not necessarily that intuitive.
I think that's, if we have half and half split, I feel like that's enough to just stay with what we currently have then. Allowed routes.
Okay.
Yeah, although I was a strong +1, like allowed routes is acceptable. But I had never read it and not understood what it meant personally.
All right, well, it sounds like there's not enough support for this either way, so leaving it as is probably fine. Oh, it looks like there's a suggestion in chat for route selector. I agree that if there's no selector inside of it, I am very hesitant to include selector in the name of the field. Yeah, my hunch here is just to leave this as is. But if anyone has any alternatives or wants to push for anything else, definitely add it here or in another issue. Any last thoughts? Cool. All right. Next one, RC2 timeline. Actually, Nick, you added one at the end that is entirely relevant here. What's left for V1 Alpha 2 review? I need to follow up with all the reviewers individually. My last status check is that Dan and Cal and Tim now are complete through the review. Andrew was planning on starting if we were still in the review process, but by no means intended to be a blocker. So if review was considered complete, he didn't want his lack of review to block our process. That's my understanding right now of the current state of review. Review has two parts though, of course. There's the feedback and there's the actual responding to that feedback. This is the PR that has the latest bit of feedback. Combined with Harry, I think we respond to almost everything in here. The one that I have not addressed yet is this, the one that we just talked about today, which is spec and status. But we're awfully close on this front, I think. I look back through the previous PR, it's absolutely massive. I know that Susan has one PR that she's working on that's, I think, almost like probably 95% done as far as webhook validation. There was some feedback on that one. I think that's the last missing piece of that original API review PR, but I very well could have missed something. There's a lot of comments there. So that's my understanding of the current scope of V1 Alpha 2 review. Can anyone think of anything else that I may have missed, or any other questions around this process?
That covers my question, was just, you know,
Okay.
what else we need to do to have the formal part done so that we can be like, okay, we tick that box. Now
Yeah.
all we've got to do is actually close out the, you know, all the actions that we're finishing, you know, so we can then put all of the stuff that we need to finish into a milestone and call that, okay, when that's
Yeah.
done, that's Alpha 2 done.
Yeah. Yeah. To me, it feels like we're awfully close to that. The one thing that I'll say, the PR 780, which was the original massive PR feedback, the one thing that is kind of untouched right now is port. The discussion around whether port should be optional or not ended up being more complicated than I expected. And that has led me to this discussion about really our API compatibility. Because if we have a strong story for how we can make a field optional in the future, it doesn't really matter if we make port optional now. But if, on the other hand, the outcome of this is it's a real pain to make a field optional in the future, we really need to address port optionality now. This is my perspective. So although this feels a little tangential, that's kind of at least part of why I've been digging into what does compatibility look like, what as we release V1 Alpha 2, what are we actually committing to? Because that drives some of our other decisions around this release in my mind. James, you've got a hand.
Yeah, so my understanding has always been that moving from required to optional is a compatible change, because anything that you had in the past, you have required, so you're fine. Anything you have in the future is optional. So that seems okay to me. I
generally think so. That's something that has been true of upstream APIs in Kubernetes. The relatively unique thing here is that because we have this kind of undefined version skew here, what we don't want to see happen is a user is running old version of vendor A and new version of vendor B, and new version of vendor B comes along with a new API version where field X is optional all of a sudden. And that means that vendor B, whatever the older vendor is in my example, their implementation starts to crash because they weren't expecting an empty value. They don't know how to handle an empty value because this field was required. This is kind of all going back to that skew and what we want to require implementations to support. And the alternative is that every implementation handles, any required field has an empty check, a nil check, or whatever it is for that type, and can handle that, which is also not great. So that's.
Don't we need to set it up to be a pointer type in the first place? Because you can't nil any field.
Yeah, no, you're right. If they were using an old client library, I think they would just get an empty value instead of a nil value. Like I think the way it would be serialized is just an empty like a 0 for an int.
It'd be a 0.
Which is
Yeah,
just-
like for port, like your code could crash if you have a port 0, or maybe it throws it away or does something arbitrary. Like it's kind of undefined right now, probably because it's invalid. So
Yeah.
So, I mean, if we are going to have it be required, the absolute minimum we should do is define what the behavior is if it's set to 0.
Yeah,
Like-
I agree with that.
But
Yeah,
then
like
it's
that.
kind of a problem. Like the issue is that the only reason I would do something with it if it's 0 is if I knew that it was optional, at which point I would just update my code. But the problem is that I wrote this code a year ago and now the specs changed because users are running the old version. So I can't exactly
I
go
think
and
this is
change
just
what I did.
maybe it's like for every required field, we should define the 0 behavior.
I agree. Yes, the 0 behavior should be defined. That definition may be, having this be 0 is not valid and is an error, but it should be defined.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. Like almost every required value. Like if you get an object that you don't think is valid, then you would treat it as an error, even if it's not possible to get that through CRD validation. But because the CRD validation can change in the future, right? So that's a 0 port, maybe a protocol you don't understand that was newly added, something like that.
Yeah. Yeah, that's the direction I've been thinking about too. I think if that's an acceptable path for implementations, it definitely makes API compatibility much simpler. Okay.
Yeah, I feel like that's a pretty easy rule to write out as well for us being the Gateway API project of defining CRDs, that if a value is required, the spec must include a definition for what happens with the 0 value.
Yeah, that seems fair.
And if it's
Okay.
not, and if it is required, it shouldn't be a pointer probably as well.
Yeah, that's exactly it. I think every field that is currently required is not a pointer, but we should double check that. And so then, yeah, you're just handling the 0 value of that field. Bowie, were you about to say something? No.
Oh, I wasn't muted, but I was just typing on the keyboard.
Oh, okay, no, that's fine. So yeah, my original question here was about RC2 timeline and what seems reasonable. The way I look at RC2 is we're so close to V1 Alpha 2 being ready, we should save RC2 until it is what we think is V1 Alpha 2, right? Like there should be next to 0 difference between RC2 and our final V1 Alpha 2 release in my mind. Does that?
Yeah, that makes sense. But the question I would ask then is, why do an RC2?
Yeah, that could be that we had an RC2 before. Why not have another one? No, that's not a valid answer. My concern is that if it gives us one more chance to get some feedback on a release before we flip that hopefully identical release to an actual API version. But I'm not completely convinced it's necessary either. So yeah.
Okay.
Bowie's saying in chat that if I'm understanding your comment correctly in chat, it's that RC2 is equivalent release in this case.
Just release.
Yeah, if we don't see any changes coming in, then yes, then you just put the release on it and it's done.
Yeah. Okay.
But we do have some changes, at least in the queue. So it's clear we need to do another one.
So, well,
I see what you're saying.
I mean,
so you're saying so right now we're on RC1, we've got a bunch of changes. So we should cut an RC2, let everyone check RC2. And then if there's no changes between RC2, then
That's right.
Then you do. Yeah. Okay.
Okay. That sounds fair.
Yeah.
All right. So if we're planning on RC2, it sounds like we want to get the vast majority of things from API feedback, Signet feedback in before we cut RC2, because we want RC2 to be effectively equivalent to our final V1 Alpha 2 release. Does it feel possible to cut an RC2 or aim to cut an RC2 next week?
That seems reasonable to me. I haven't looked at what's in the milestone, but
yeah, I need to add a couple PRs that I've created today, and Harry has one that should go in as well. Our milestone keeps on getting expanded here.
What about the changes we just agreed on for required values? Defining the
that's a big one.
That's a lot of work, I think.
Yeah, that's I forget where that discussion came up, but we need to create an issue to track that. Any volunteers to handle what's that?
Put me down.
Awesome, thank you. Cool. So that is a lot of work. I agree. I think fortunately we have a fairly small number of required fields in our API. If I'm remembering correctly, so hopefully it won't be quite as large in scope as it seems on the surface, but we'll have to double check. But we really do want to have some guidance on, and a lot of it could be very repetitive of if this field is a 0 value, it's simply not valid and you should throw out, whatever it is.
I think in this case, the repetitiveness is probably okay. It's better to be explicit repetitive.
Yeah. So let's aim for next week for RC2. And that leads me to my follow-up question here is, does it seem possible to get a final V1 Alpha 2 cutout this month? So in September. So let's say RC2 next week and V1 Alpha 2 the following week.
Yeah, that sounds good.
Okay. We'll just we'll aim for that and we'll see what happens, but I'll try and just throw some dates on milestone and actually add add PRs that should be in the milestone to the milestone. Yeah, okay. That's all I had. Is there anything else we should cover real quickly? Anyone that needs a PR reviewed or issue discussed? All right, well, thank you everyone. This has been great. I will not be here next week, but thanks to Nick or Bowie for leading next meeting, and we'll talk to you later.
Thanks, Rob. See you next week. Well, see you the week after.